Good afternoon. It is nearly 4:30 here in the UK. So, obviously, God, I've got something about it. Obviously, we have a lot of new subscribers to the channel, and the channel keeps growing. I do apologise for the lack of content this week. I had some issues with my internet whilst watching the FA Cup replays, so I couldn't ultimately post any content to do with that. And to be fair, the work week I've had, it's been a bit exhausting. So there's been no Six Nations content. I don't really have the energy to really watch the Six Nations this weekend. So I will look at where nations are at uh, during the week because it's a bye week. There's no Six Nations matches uh, next weekend, so we can have a little look at the standings and where each nation is at in regards to that. Obviously, some housekeeping. So the new subscribers, obviously, you've got to be a subscriber to comment, and you have to be a subscriber for 20 minutes at least before you can post a comment. You will notice that we have a lot of moderators. You'll see the blue spanner next to their name and their name in blue in the chat. They're the moderators, and they obviously assist with the channel and keeping things neat and tidy. And now let's begin. Also, another rule: keep politics out of the chat. It's a sports channel, not a politics channel, so we keep that out of the chat. Otherwise, that is the housekeeping done. So, let us begin. Obviously, the NRL pre-season matches are taking place, and of course, St Helens are out in Australia to play the World Cup Challenge against Penrith. That takes place next weekend, and that is a very eagerly anticipated match that I've been looking forward to for 3 years because St Helens have been the dominant side in Super League, and Penrith have been the dominant side in the NRL in recent years. And of course, because of the pandemic, we haven't had the World Cup Challenge for 3 years, so long overdue. Long overdue to have that match played. There's been a bit of criticism aimed at St Helens over the fact that there were some issues and they could have played the World Cup Challenge last year. They didn't, um, and there was some criticism of St Helens as an organisation in regards to not playing the game last year. They're in Australia right now. They played the St George Illawarra Dragons and won at the weekend yesterday. So hey, let's see how it pans out. They've got a very, very strong, stable team. Have St Helens, Penrith. They've had some big name players leave in recent weeks. So Penrith, while they are still on paper the best team in the league, in my opinion, there's some transition going on there with some key players leaving, and how will that affect the lineup they put out next weekend and how they play. So we'll see what happens. But I think Penrith go in as favourites, which would be interesting. But St Helens have been the dominant side in Europe for the best part of the last 3-4 years. So we'll see how that pans out. Obviously, the Man City allegations of breaches of financial fair play and other rule breaches when it comes to football, likelihood is they will be punished. And likelihood is they are going to be found guilty, whether it's trial by social media or not. It's the likely outcome. Obviously, there's that previous UEFA investigation where they were actually charged, and yes, they got certain parts of their punishment overturned, but other parts of their punishment were upheld. So it's looking increasingly likely that Man City will face punishment. How severe the punishment is, we shall wait and see. I would reckon it's going to be at a more severe end of the punishment scale. But then that opens up a whole host of other clubs to potential investigation and or punishment because it's not just Man City that have been breaking the rules. I wouldn't be surprised if most clubs, not only in the Premier League but throughout football, have broken not only domestic league rules but UEFA rules. And it just so happens that Man City are one of the clubs on the hit list. But in reality, the amount of clubs that openly and continually break rules is quite high. So there is the potential for a Pandora's box to be opened in regards to investigations being opened against other clubs. So we have to be careful what we wish for. Also, in the English Premier League, Manchester United, there is a big hint at the owner of Ineos, who also owns Nice, and Qatari investment being interested in Manchester United. And that Amnesty International have already raised their concerns in regards to the potential of Qatari investment in buying a stake in Manchester United. They were very, very similar in their concerns about Newcastle United with the Saudi takeover. What is very, very interesting is they were pretty silent about the Man City takeover, very, very silent. So there's a bit of hypocritical nature there. But yes, Amnesty International have raised some concerns about the potential of Qatari investment uh, in Manchester United should that go ahead. They're not the only parties interested in buying a partial or full stake in the club. So we'll see how that all plays out. Obviously, we recently had the Football World Cup in Qatar. That was a controversial tournament. While I felt the tournament itself and the quality of play was good, I don't think it's the best World Cup I've ever seen. I don't buy into that. Yes, there was a lot of the controversy surrounding the build up to the tournament and certain things that happened at the tournament. But there was a lot of polarization in regards to how things were reported and how what people bought into, whether they were for or against the World Cup. I was sort of sat on the fence going, well, there's some good and bad about this tournament. Every major sports event has those pros and cons, there's negatives and there's positives. I felt that social media gave a much better reflection of the actual fans on the ground about the good things about the World Cup and the negatives of things about the World Cup. And there were some potential flashpoints. Yes, there wasn't a lot of fan trouble. There was a few issues with some fan bases over in Qatar, but there wasn't really um, trouble there. And you could argue, I think, the strict laws over there and the sheer cost of going put off a lot of potential troublemakers from travelling to the Middle East to watch games. So there is that. But overall, obviously, the backdrop of the concerns leading into the World Cup in Qatar and the potential for Qatari investment in Manchester United and Amnesty International. So that's why I put that one in. The NRL still has the standoff with the Rugby League Players Association in regards to the CBA negotiations. Um, this has the potential to flare up during the regular season. Obviously, we are. This is not a good situation for the league or the players to be in. So that technically means, whilst we're in the pre-season for the NRL, the regular season starts in 2 weeks. We haven't got a CBA. That cannot continue long term. It's not a desirable outcome long term. It cannot continue because that raises the possibility of a lockout or strike or a player boycott of certain things down the line. And this is in a period when there is expansion, when they've got the next team on the horizon. Most likely the North Sydney Bears, as things currently stand, although it's possible that any potential expansion bid could be put in from any location in Australia or New Zealand. Um, and that you've also got the issues surrounding the potential for games being played in the US that the NRL wants to get in place. Obviously, the NRL wanted to play games in the US from this year. South Sydney pulled out of that. And it looks very likely that a game or games will be played in the US from 2024 onwards. So there's, the lack of a CBA could throw a spanner in the works in that regard. And obviously, that will be part of the discussion in regards to a CBA. Where from what I gather, the players don't have an issue playing games in the US. I think the issues are to do with post-retirement care, medical bills, minimum salary, um, further strengthening working conditions in regards to player welfare, and so that isn't as big an issue. My thoughts on Welsh rugby at the moment. Well, where to begin? Now, I haven't watched any of the Six Nations matches this weekend. I've had other things going on which have required more urgent attention. And to be fair, rugby union, I'm falling out of love with rugby union, but my thoughts on the situation right now haven't changed throughout the history of the channel. The financial aspect of the game in Wales has finally caught up with them at the international level. I think COVID has sped up the issues with Welsh rugby massively. I've had a long running battle with Welsh rugby union fans of the national side for the best part of 6 years. That's not going to change. But jokes aside, and some of the comments and issues I've had with the Welsh Union and fans of said Welsh Union, the situation is quite serious. I think there's clear concerns about development at grassroots, the finances of the sport in Wales, and getting sponsorship in there, the direction the sport's taking, and the fact they've rehired Warren Gatland is not necessarily a step forward. I think it's a stopgap measure. I don't know how long his contract lasts, but that's a stopgap measure. Just because it worked before doesn't mean it's going to work now. There's a reason why he stood down in after the 2019 World Cup. There's a reason why Wayne Pivac was selected to replace him, um, and he was part of the reason why Wayne Pivac was installed as head coach at the time. It also concerns about the lack of depth of Welsh coaches because Warren Gatland was in the position for a very, very long time. We know that. Wayne Pivac is also a Kiwi. So the fact that the Welsh national side has not been coached by a Welshman for nearly 2 decades tells you all you need to know about the state of the game. That they don't have a coach they deem good enough to coach the national side. Now, you could argue many nations now choose overseas coaches. It don't have to be a nation of origin. That's fine. Would it be good for the Six Nations of Scotland win it? Well, they won the last of the Five Nations, didn't they? I think it'd be better for Scottish rugby if they did well. They've had a very good start to this year's tournament, which we can't deny. But I think, to me, it doesn't matter who wins the Six Nations because that's saying that we're the best team in the Northern Hemisphere. What's concerning about the state of rugby in general is the finances. And this has been a talking point on this channel for the best part of 4 or 5 years. COVID notwithstanding, is the finances of the game are not as healthy as predicted they would be back in 1995 with the onset of professionalism. So somewhere along the line, in the last 27, 28 years, something has gone very, very horribly wrong with the finances of the sport. Now, at an international level, the sport's gone leaps and bounds. The growth of the World Cup, the strengthening of the tier two nations, the growth of the tier one nation pool, basically, those top nations at the top level. Um, the international game is in a very, very good position when it comes to World Cup, Six Nations, American Championships, things like that, regional championships. On a more, it's the club level that's a mess, and the actual finances of the sport that are in a um, situation. Yeah, 99. It wasn't a Grand Slam, but it was the last Five Nations, and Scotland won it, and that's the last time Scotland have been relevant in this conversation for 24 years. It's been a very difficult 2.5 decades for Scottish rugby. They've had some decent Six Nations performances, but they have been dreadful. Not much better than Italy, in my opinion. Italy haven't always got the wooden spoon. It's only been the last decade that Italy have really stagnated. It's recent times Italy have started to show, the last couple of years, Italy have started to show that green shoot of recovery. Same with Scotland. Um, Scotland have been dreadful for the best part of 2 decades. Um, Wales, under the Gatland era, stabilised and obviously had some very successful spells under Warren Gatland. But for them to go back to the previous regime is a concern because he even stated when he stood down he had taken the team as far as he could. The game was evolving faster than he could evolve as a coach, and that he was fatigued and he needed time away. Um, but he was instrumental in getting Wayne Pivac selected as his successor. Now, the fact that that has failed is for a number of reasons, but it does highlight coaching issues. And Gatland doesn't have Sean Edwards to back him up with that barcover and that bite. Good cop, bad cop. He doesn't have Sean Edwards to support him anymore because he's with the French setup. And he's very happy with the French setup. And those who were his assistants, some of whom carried on under Pivac, are out of the job. Rob Howley and Stephen Jones didn't work with them as part of the setup. So, and with Rob Howley's case, there was some breaches of betting rules. So there's clearly issues within Welsh rugby. Can we now say Welsh football is better than Welsh rugby? I think that's a dangerous argument to have. I think Welsh football's had a little golden spell itself, with qualifying for 3 major tournaments out, I think 5 attempts. But Gareth Bale and Joe Allen and Ramsey's on his last legs. Their best players are now retiring from the international game. And then you've got the backdrop of what happened to Gary Speed, who laid the foundations for what we now have with the Welsh setup. and his untimely passing, and with what's happened with Ryan Giggs with his legal issues, which I think has the potential. I know that the current coaching setup is really good, and I know that they've got some good shoots coming through with some good young players, but they've lost some key players literally the last few days through retirement and injury. So, and you could argue some of those players didn't fulfil their fullest potential. Um, and maybe Wales overachieved. I think a lot of issues do lie, however, with the economy of Wales for one, and the fact that the majority of sport that happens in Wales happens in the southeast of the country, in like Newport, Cardiff, and Swansea, and of course Wrexham with Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney in their investment. Um, and obviously, with Wrexham, for example, they want to bring the racecourse ground back up to international standard, which is why they're rebuilding the Cop End. So you could argue, yes, they should take more internationals outside of Cardiff and around the country to increase the participation of fans and reach a wider audience. But the domestic league in Wales is crap and has money problems. Same with rugby union. Same with rugby league. Welsh professional sport below the international level is at club level is in serious trouble. Um, and you've got to look at the economics of Wales and the economic standpoint of Wales. So you've got to look at the social aspect, the economic aspect, um, and what Welsh fans' disposable income is. And so there is that economic standpoint to it. Now, hopefully, Wrexham do make it back to the Football League, because I think that will give Welsh football a boost and just Welsh sport in general a boost. And obviously, with Swansea and Cardiff and Newport, Cardiff have got their problems. Swansea aren't the team they were either. And Newport are a lower level Football League club. So, really, Welsh football isn't in the healthiest state just because the national side's, I think, overachieved in the last decade. I think there's more to it than that. Um, but Welsh professional sport has a lot of issues because most of the money's in the south of Wales, in a very small area of Wales. I mean, and the majority of the population is in that area as well. But there isn't the corporate money in Wales, um, and most of the best Welsh talent, especially when it comes to football, don't play in Wales. So they've got that issue as well to contend with. And on an economic standpoint, the Welsh economy does have a knock-on impact on the quality of you know what fans can spend. So it does impact club income, and obviously vast parts of Wales were involved in the steel industry and the coal industry and other mining industries as well. And those jobs have gone, so there's higher unemployment in certain parts of Wales. And then mid Wales, it's agricultural country, and agricultural wages are never very high anyway. So there's your problem: is there's some very sparsely populated areas in Wales, and a lot of those who are employed who do have an income don't have a lot of money anyway, because especially in mid Wales and central Wales, for example, it's agricultural industries and they don't pay a lot. Um, and there isn't the population to sustain a high level professional team in whatever sport we're looking at. And so there's another issue. Um, now, Welsh Rugby Union is a mess, and I think what's not helped is the bullying. I'm going to call it the bullying scandal, and how the Welsh Union dealt with complaints about high-ranking officials about their conduct, and that has really damaged the union's reputation, both domestically and abroad, with how they dealt with complaints from women, from you know uh, staff in general, and the lack of action taken in dealing with those complaints. Um, and so there is a lack of trust in the union. Now, on top of that, the domestic club game is in a financial mess, and there's no proposals to fix it that actually make any logical sense. And then the domestic rugby union game at the semi-pro level was just bankrupt, and finally that's had a knock-on impact on the national side on the field, um, which is concerning. Now, the, the worry is that yeah, I think Wales will most likely get the win. I think even Italy are too good for them. And the issues were highlighted obviously last year, and they were highlighted quite badly. And the record on the Wayne Pivac was shocking. Apart from the COVID impacted Six Nations, which they won, it wasn't great. So there's a lot of question marks with the direction the national side's taking, but also player development, attendances, the economics, and the finances. And there doesn't seem to be a very good solution. I mean, the Welsh Union is in crisis and has been in crisis for a very long time. And the financial struggles. Yeah, the COVID Six Nations. I mean, look, my feelings about rugby union as a sport and as a footballing code, because obviously we've got all the different footballing codes, and I've done videos on that. But my thoughts on rugby union and my feelings for it. Um, this I'm starting to fall out of love with the sport. There's simple. I'm starting to fall out of love with the sport. I could be watching the Six Nations right now, and I'm not. And I'm falling out of love with the sport and the direction it is taking. I think uh, I don't watch it as much as I used to. I think in the last, I'm going to say 5, 6 years, I've really started to tune out. Um, I don't enjoy rugby union as much as I used to, considering I used to play the sport. I first played the sport when I was 7. Um, I've played it as an adult, as an amateur. I've but I don't enjoy the sport as much as I used to pre-COVID. And there's a variety of reasons for that. I think they're mishandling some of their rule changes. I think they got some of their rule changes terribly wrong. They're not enforcing the rules that are already there, which have led to issues such as the tackle area, the scrum, ruck and maul, the contact area, having they make a lot of knee-jerk reactionary changes, but they've allowed by lax governance and to allow those areas where obviously injury can be it's quite contact heavy sport, obviously, but the risk of injury is increased. Um, but the tackle area and the tackle height debate, if the rules had been properly enforced for the last 25 years, we wouldn't be having this issue right now. It's got nothing to do with players getting bigger and bulky. I mean, that's got a little bit to do with it, but it's to do with really shocking tackle technique. And that has to be coached. You don't just have a bad tackle technique because you're coached from a young age to tackle properly. Um, so rugby has allowed itself to get itself into a bad position, basically, through lax, weak governance, and then they become very reactionary in how they respond to a crisis. I understand, obviously, that we know more about concussions now than what we did 5 years ago, 10 years ago. A lot more research has been done. I understand that. However, uh, I, I'm only enjoying certain sports now. When I started the channel, I would be more happy to casually watch a lot more sports. So I'm not enjoying all sport as much. Oversaturation, I think, is a thing. It's definitely a thing. Um, as I said, I'm enjoying football a lot less. Um, I'm enjoying rugby union a hell of a lot less, and various forms of motorsport I don't enjoy as much. There are others that I do, and some that I don't. I wouldn't say age has got a factor to do with it because a lot of fans are of a lot of fans that are lifelong fans are older. I wouldn't say necessarily age, but I would definitely have a thought about how sports present themselves. Um, sport, the negative headlines will have an impact. Absolutely. Um, there's only certain sports that I'm really passionate about now. So when I did my in 2018, I did my favourites, my list ranking my favourite sports in order of how I enjoy them. Um, yeah, I haven't watched the last two Olympics. I think I watched 5 minutes in total of both the Winter and Summer Olympics. Um, in the last 12 months. So the delayed Tokyo and the Beijing Olympics, I watched five. I was planning to watch the ice hockey because the NHL players were meant to go last year to the Olympics, and obviously at the last minute they decided no, the COVID restrictions, there's too much risk, we're not going. So Olympic sport doesn't interest me anymore. The Commonwealth Games, I didn't watch a single event at the Commonwealth Games. And apparently the Commonwealth Games last year was really, really good. Who knew? Um, I didn't watch every game at this year's Football World Cup, but work had an impact on that, so I couldn't. But I wanted to, but at the same time, I couldn't. The Women's World Cup this summer, I won't be able to watch every game, partly because the zone differential is in Australia and New Zealand, so I won't be able to watch every game like I did 4 years ago in 2019, um, which is again a shame. But I'm starting to, as each day passes, I enjoy football less and less. And with what we've seen through COVID and with the European Super League and clubs going bust, and some of the suspicious takeovers and some of the corruption scandals that continue to litter the sport. Um, see what happens. Oh, look, the Super League thing, they're going to keep trying. The clubs that keep bringing it up are the same three clubs that are buggered. Now, unfortunately, the way UEFA have restructured the proposed restructuring of the Champions League, I think, has strengthened um, their hand a little bit to keep pushing. But fans cannot disunite now. And you know, in my viewpoint, the Super League will do more harm than good. Um, with the way football currently is, there's more harm than good, and I think the direction we're taking anyway is of a negative direction with the sport on a club level globally, let alone just in Europe. Our domestic football's dying anyway. Um, been chronically mismanaged. You just look at the Man City situation; they're not the only club to have breached financial fair play. They're claiming Man City. I'll say it's a witch hunt. It isn't because they're not the only club have been punished, ironically, or being investigated. What it does raise concerns about yet again is the transparency of ownership, who owns clubs, and clearly the failure, massive failure this time of the directors' test, blatant. Um, it took a hacker and a couple of whistleblowers to really bring it to light. So club auditing is a joke. And it clearly shows that at the time, the football authorities didn't care who owned clubs as long as the money was coming in. Now there's an economic crisis of a much bigger proportion than the financial crash of 2007, 2008, and the euro crisis that followed in the next couple of years. Now that the economics has really been impacted by a global pandemic and there's rising tensions and there's conflict on the continent of Europe, suddenly UEFA and the domestic league suddenly care what happens, where the money comes from. Um, but I'm very quickly fallen out of love with the sport. Um, yeah, obviously most of the content on the channel is football related, and most of the viewers of this channel are football fans or soccer fans if you're North American and Australian, of course. But in reality, the sports I'm more passionate about, I should do more content on. I really should. Like rugby league, like ice hockey, I really should. I should do some more, team history videos and yeah, things like that. However, the majority of viewers of this channel are football fans. It is the most popular sport in the UK. It's the most popular sport in Europe, and the majority and the US. There's a lot of European viewers, and so I'm very popular in Spain and Germany, for example, where the domestic football leagues are still the most popular leagues, regardless of the competitiveness of the Bundesliga and La Liga, with how few clubs actually recent times have won those leagues. But football is the global sport by some margin. The reason why I do videos on more niche sports is because I know there's a growing interest because there's a growing frustration from sports fans in regards to football and in regards to things like F1 and golf, some of the major international sports which have a global appeal because major tournaments are played in every continent and the top players are from all over the world. There is a growing frustration, and it's like, look at golf; it's a very divided sport. Snooker's got massive problems. Motorsport is at a transitional crossroads with changes in technology and things of that nature. Pub games are very interesting. Yes, there's some very fun pub games, but yeah, they're interesting. As I say, I'm still willing to give every sport a go. And obviously, there's some of the got. Yeah, well, look, certain athletes like there's golf fans who only follow Tiger Woods, for example, or Sergio Garcia or Greg Norman. But yeah, once Ronnie O'Sullivan retires, much like when Djokovic and Nadal decide to call it a day, and Andy Murray, those certain fans who only follow that particular athlete because they're maybe from the same town or the same country, suddenly, yeah, you will suddenly lose that iconic superstar. So when Djokovic and Nadal go, which will be soon, and Murray, will tennis still have that bounce? Will they still have loads of fans that are staying with the sport? Because the reason why the sport remains popular in England is because of Tim Henman and then ultimately Andy and Jamie Murray. Um, uh, I couldn't comment on the Australian viewing figures. I don't know if that's just domestic or internationally. But looking at how the NHL viewership figures are down by a quarter on last year, by around 20 to 25%. I think it averages out at 22%, but and certain studies say 20%, other studies say 25, 26%. Viewership figures are down anyway across a lot of sports for a variety of reasons. And look at my NHL video; that just tells you all you need to know. So there are certain broadcasters and certain sports that viewership figures are down. Now, why the Australian Open viewing figures are down, I could not tell you. I know Djokovic is a very divisive figure in Australian sport because of what happened last year, and very, very divisive with the Australian public domestically. On a global standpoint, you've got to look at the international broadcast rights that the organisers of the Australian Open and the ATP have negotiated with their media partners. Because the only two majors out of the four that are on free-to-air coverage in the UK, at least, are the French Open with ITV and Wimbledon with the BBC. The other two are on satellite broadcasters or Amazon. Um, so that's interesting. Should Djokovic be dominating at his age, or is this generation not very good? I think this generation is a little bit more competitive than the generation before. And when Djokovic retires, it really opens all the Grand Slams up. He's not winning every single Grand Slam, and even with the dominant generation of Federer and Nadal and Murray, there was Wawrinka and Del Potro and Cilic were winning majors, so winning Grand Slams. So I wouldn't say he, a lot will tell with Djokovic, because Nadal on the French Open, anything's possible. Quite honestly. And then you've got the US Open at the end of the year, so anything's possible. And Djokovic has had his injury issues, but he's a more divisive champion than John McEnroe, for example. That's thinking that's hard. And Connors and McEnroe, their rivalry, he's more divisive than them. So there's that. I don't find it staggering because Federer's won double digits as well. I think Andy Murray would have won more without injury. So I think that's helped Djokovic that a comparable rival has been injured a lot in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. That could have won more titles against him. I know Nadal's done it at the French Open, so no, I don't find that staggering. Federer's done it at Wimbledon, I believe, so I don't find that staggering because certain players can dominate a certain. But yeah, the last 2 decades has been dominated by 3 to 5 players, depending on how you would class dominance. And it's a difficult one because Nadal was less divisive than Djokovic. Well, Nadal has his detractors as well. He was told people said, "Oh, he can't win on anything but clay." He's proven he can win all four majors. Um, People thought Andy Murray would be a flash in the pan, like and a nearly man like Hedman and Brzezinski. He's proven he can win multiples and Olympic gold. But with Andy Murray, since his Olympic gold and his three Grand Slam wins, his career's been destroyed by injury. Destroyed. And not enough attention is given to his brother Jamie Murray with the doubles, because he's won majors as well. Um, I wouldn't say he would have won more in a different era because he would still have the same injuries, so his body's breaking down. He's still one of the greatest players of all time. It's just his body has let him down. And some of the decisions Murray has made with coaching setup and training camps and his relationship with the leader and his family haven't helped him. Great British, well, I think his brother Jamie, I think, is just as great and less in the spotlight. And I prefer Jamie Murray over Andy Murray with how more laid back and relaxed he is. That's a difficult one. We've had some great champions, but not as many as we should do, and that's fact. I think for win percentage, yes, and for the amount he's won and his prize, it's the most successful prize money and winning in the modern era, yes. But I think Raducanu, there's a possibility if she's properly supported and guided that she could probably surpass him, and she's young enough to do so. Jamie Murray, if he keeps winning doubles titles, could ultimately do quite well, but the doubles doesn't get the same coverage as the singles. I couldn't tell you who the number one is, and that's a problem. We've got a lot more players in the top 50 and top 100 than we did before Andy Murray came along, and even before Hedman. So the quality of depth is now there, and considering that Nadal and Djokovic and Murray are at the end of their careers, Grand Slams are going to be a lot more open. I think it's Norrie, I think, if I'm not mistaken, or Evans, one of the two, either Norrie or Evans. Their chances of getting to a Grand Slam final or winning a Grand Slam are a lot higher now than what they were 10, 15 years ago. We've definitely got more depth than we had before, which is partly, I think, mainly down to Tim Henman, ironically. Tim Henman started this whole growth in the sport. Without Tim Henman, and then to a certain extent, Greg Brzezinski, you don't have Andy and Jamie Murray. Without them, you don't have Will Robson, I know she retired, and Raducanu, and Norrie, and Evans, and the other players who are go on. Djokovic and Nadal. I think Nadal's done at the end of this year, maybe next year. He's got a degenerative. He's got a bone condition in his feet where his joints are falling apart, and he'll need multiple surgeries just to be able to walk. And he's got a degenerative bone and joint condition with his ligaments and his bones, which is really starting to impact his ability to lead a normal life, let alone play. So he's playing through health issues. Djokovic, he's had a lot of elbow injuries with his serving arm, and then there could be another Australian Open issue where he's has some visa issues, and he does have some very outspoken politics and views, and his father doesn't help. How long will they go on for? I mean, Djokovic is a few years younger than Nadal. Nadal, I think, is close to retirement for basic medical reasons, because injury and health reasons are starting to really hamper his ability to play at the top level. And now Federer's gone. We'll see what happens. Murray, I don't think he's got long left either. I think those three are really on their last legs now when it comes to being at the top level for a consistent period of time. Injury has, at various points, these guys could have been even more successful if it wasn't for injury. That's sinking. I think Federer's more loved than any of them. I think Nadal's become more loved as time has gone on. I think Djokovic is very unloved. I think what's interesting is Federer has always conducted himself like a gentleman, 100%. Very calm, very respectful, the ultimate. Nadal has gained respect, and I like Nadal. Didn't always, but I like Nadal. He's gained respect as time has gone on. Djokovic has gone the other way. Djokovic had a lot of respect when he was young and vibrant and starting to win and see the ability there. As time has gone on, it's become less loved. And Murray, it's a love-hate relationship with people with Andy Murray. They love him, they hate him, they love him, they hate him. Um, I think, in my opinion, Federer, I think, has just had that respect constantly, and I think Nadal's gained that respect with how he's matured as an athlete and matured as an individual from this really explosive, aggressive youngster all those years ago to a more rounded statesman in the sport. Whereas Djokovic is more controversial, um, and as time has gone on, um, more people are globally. It's not just like, oh, because he's Serbian, his dad has links to the Russians and all that. Um, some of his antics and actions and how he conducts himself and how he appears to be in person. He's maybe a lovely guy, but he's less lovable um, than than some of his contemporaries. Like Stan Wawrinka is also a bit hit and miss with how people feel about Stan Wawrinka. He's a bit divisive, and he was a decent champion for a period. And then you look at Serena Williams. She's not particularly well loved, and she doesn't particularly like the fact she's not well loved because she expects to be loved. Because look at me. Whereas Venus is more respected out of the two Williams sisters. I think Kim Clijsters was a very, very respected champion. Monica Seles was quite well respected. And then you look at people like Sharapova and others, and yeah, really. It's a very difficult one because the media has a big part to play in this. And this is where people are falling out of love with the mainstream media is how they report certain things and how they cover certain things. So the whole situation with Djokovic's visa issues a year ago at the Australian Open was to do with their COVID policy, and that was the policy of the Australian government. How that was handled was a shambles on the organisers' side of things and the government side of things. How Djokovic responded wasn't great either. There were other tennis players who didn't meet the criteria unless there were certain exemptions in place, but they got less slated in the media because they were A, a less big name, or B, they behaved with a bit more dignity and respect in regards to the situation. But Djokovic and his supporters and his camp really made a bigger thing out of it. Um, and the way that was handled by all sides was just a shambles. Good evening, Jordan. How are you doing? But again, individual athletes in sports like tennis, which are individualistic sports, or you know, team sports like certain players in football or rugby or ice hockey or cricket, like Kevin Peterson, like in cricket. And we're talking about an individual, whether people like or hate. Um, couldn't stand Kevin Peterson. Can't stand Kevin Peterson. And a lot of his ex teammates don't like him either. That doesn't mean he's a bad player, and that doesn't mean he's a nasty person. But he was a very controversial figure when he was selected to first play for England. He was controversial from the 2005 Ashes right up until his retirement. He's controversial in South Africa. He's controversial here. Um, and cricket fans across the world find him a very divisive, controversial figure. You either love him or hate him. I never liked Kevin Peterson. I never felt, even though we won a lot of matches with Peterson in the side, I never felt actually that the balance of the team in the dressing room was a harmonious group of players. And a lot of it's down to Kevin Peterson. Now, what's come out about the England setup and behind closed doors and the culture of the sport and personalities and stuff, it's not just on Kevin Peterson, but there's a lot of negativity about cricket that's coming out as time goes by, like certain individuals. And Kevin Peterson's one of those individuals that there's a lot of controversy surrounding and a lot of debate around. Whether he should have been part of England's setup. And then we have to look at the reasons why he was never part of it. It didn't work out with the South African setup and why he ended up being such a pariah for both nations. Why the educated Australian fan? Now, the Australian fans, you've got the educated Australian fans, and then you have the hardcore, bogans, as I call them, with their utes and their cans of lager, their tinnies. You can be an overseas, like a South African or a Kiwi or an English player playing in Australia against the Australians in Australia, and the fans can still love you even though you're the enemy. Peterson never got that respect. There's certain things that Peterson has done in the media. He's thrown certain teammates under the bus, former teammates under the bus. He's been very controversial. It's a bit of a pain in the ass for the ECB as well. Um, My thoughts on the CONMEBOL inviting the six CONCACAF, six best CONCACAF. I think it's a positive. I think it means a unification of the Gold Cup and the Copa America. In my opinion, I think that has a long-term objective to actually stabilise and grow the sport because, in my opinion, the US, Canada, and Mexico, Costa Rica to a certain extent, maybe Honduras, will regularly be the top five nations in CONCACAF by a country mile. So combining the two, I think, means they play against better opposition, and I think it makes more sense with an expanded World Cup coming up as well. I wouldn't say Panama, no, not even close. I would say El Salvador is probably above them, or Jamaica, or Trinidad. A couple of Caribbean nations are on a better standard than Panama on a regular basis, historically. I think eventually CONCACAF and CONMEBOL merge. I do think that will happen. I think it's a logical thing to do. It makes a lot of sense. We'll see what happens. I don't think the quality of CONCACAF is of a high enough standard, with especially with the next World Cup being co-hosted by the three top nations in CONCACAF. It has to happen in order for the sport to continue to be viable outside of Mexico and North America. The US, if they want the MLS to be a viable league and they want to have a decent quality national side, and the Canadians as well, they need to regularly play against better opposition like a Brazil or an Argentina or a Uruguay or a Chile or a Colombia or a Peru. It needs to happen. The MLS itself, I mean, what state is the MLS truly in? I mean, truly, how healthy is the MLS? Is it as healthy as the financial numbers make it seem because of ruthless expansion? Is it really a stable league once expansion stops? I mean, let's be honest here. Is the MLS really going to be a long-term success? Is it really going to catch up with the Big Four? Could it overtake the NHL and Major League Baseball, for example? The NHL is obviously having its issues with its TV rights deal, with viewership being down, and it's still trying to establish itself in those southern US markets. Major League Baseball's losing fans hand over fist. Can the MLS supplant them? Can it make more revenue? Can it be more stable? So combining the two would definitely strengthen the quality of North American football and Caribbean football and Central America. It would. But we'll wait and see. The fact that they've decided to do this, Asia and Oceania, Australasia do it. Again, Australia already goes through Asian qualifying, so we'll see what happens there. Yes, I know Panama did qualify for the 2018 World Cup, and yes, the US didn't. And there's been a big debate about that failure to qualify for the, in the US media in regards to the growth of the sport and the growth of the national side and various things in North America. Yes, it does make it easy for New Zealand to keep qualifying for World Cups now because Australia is no longer there. That's true. But football in New Zealand, soccer in New Zealand, is nowhere near on the same level as rugby league and rugby union and cricket. Really is a secondary sport. And then you've got to look at the population of New Zealand and the economics of New Zealand, the corporate money, the fact that outside of Auckland, apart from Wellington, the urban areas in New Zealand are really tiny. Like the cities in New Zealand are massive. And outside of the Auckland metro area, and to a certain extent the Wellington metro area, you don't really have the population to sustain a high enough quality of professional sport. And it's finally catching up with New Zealand, the lack of money, really, and the fact that some of the best New Zealanders don't play in New Zealand when it comes to rugby league or rugby union. They're looking overseas because they can get paid more. There's that. I'm doing all right, I guess. I think the weekend I've had, which I won't go into detail here because there's some legal ramifications with some of my friends and neighbours because there was a big incident. I mean, I suppose I can to a certain extent. There was a massive fight upstairs in my block of flats. Um, there was a fair bit of basically Friday through to Saturday was kind of an interesting 48 hours really. I got in from work as I'm getting in from work. There's a massive brawl upstairs involving some of my neighbours. Um, Obviously, the police and ambulance are here, and yeah, several of my neighbours spent some time in police custody. One of them has had his head kicked in. Another one of them is missing part of a finger. Let that sink in. So yeah, there was that. Um, and I had to deal with police and ambulance and all sorts. And yeah, just never a dull day. This is why living in a block of flats is not fun. Um, yeah, living in a block of flats. I speak to one of them. Like, well, the other ones are moving out anyway, and they've been a nightmare since they moved in. So the last 6 months have been. Well, the previous tenant in the flat that they were in was a nightmare towards the end. Other than that, the rest of the building's fine. You'll get on. It's just two flats causing all the problems, and unfortunately, um, this is private renting, and this is. Um, oh no! Loud music isn't really a problem, being honest. Um, there was another guy who lived further down the building. He had lots of loud music. He's gone as well. He got the boot. No, it's not really loud music. It's just loud neighbours. So when you know, and when I say loud neighbours, I mean domestic violence, like proper punch ups, um, proper bad. I wouldn't say loud music, but living in a block of flats, it's not particularly a pleasant experience if you've got bad neighbours. If you've got good neighbours, hey, if you say, look, you're being a bit loud tonight, you just pay it down. They're generally respectful. But when you've got neighbours that just don't give two Fs and just don't care, and also consume large amounts of alcohol and drugs and get quite violent, just shut your doors. It hasn't been the most pleasant 6 months basically, and when your neighbours keep you up every bloody night. Now, thankfully, they're moving out. One of them's currently in police custody, so I couldn't care less. And he breached his bail conditions anyway, so he's currently at His Majesty's pleasure at the moment. And the other one, who's on the lease, is moving out. So no, they don't. Thankfully, if they did, I don't care. Um, but again, my last apartment or flat, depending where you live in the world, had its own issues. And I had some crazy neighbours that I didn't particularly get on with, but I didn't really socialise with my neighbours in the last building. This building, I get on with a lot of my neighbours, and I've been in all the flats apart from I think three of them. I've been inside every other flat in the building. Um, simply because just I get on with I get on with a lot of my neighbours, and we're for the most part, we all get on and socialise. We've got communal like, outdoor areas, and it's not a massive building, but it's the neighbours that moved in there apparently. Um, but it does raise the question about community and like 20, 30 years ago, you probably knew all your neighbours. Um, you probably knew them all. Now, like I suppose I'm lucky because yeah, my block of flats isn't massive, but I couldn't tell you about the next building down, big house, like the next plot. Couldn't tell you about them. Never socialised with them. Never met. I couldn't tell you about the house behind us. Couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you. I mean, I know one of my friends lives a quarter mile down the road. Um, but yeah, I really couldn't tell you about a lot of the locals who live in the houses and apartments nearby. Couldn't tell you. Growing up on my street, I could tell you pretty much 90% of the people. Um, who they were, socialise with them. Now, apart from my block of flats, I couldn't tell you about the next 5, 10 properties if I couldn't tell you who they are. Couldn't, you know. And ironically, yes, one of my old next door neighbours was a semi-pro professional football player back in the 90s and the 2000s. Um, but right now, I couldn't tell you um, about my neighbours outside my initial block of flats. Couldn't tell you anything about. I think that's a trend that's growing in society. I couldn't tell you how long it's been going on for, but when you were kids, you probably knew the next door neighbour's kids or kids on the same street. Your parents or older siblings probably had a good relationship with your next door neighbour, probably had a barbecue or something, invited them over. Now you rarely get that. And I think that's an ongoing trend, not just here in the UK, but further afield, abroad, in many areas. Um, it, but sporting events tend to bring communities together. So you look when Leicester won the Premier League, the whole city basically came out and celebrated. Yeah, look, I mean, I think that's a fair assessment. Um, I think that's a societal trend. I seem to remember when I was a kid, when like the World Cup was on, for example. You know, when I was a kid, like the '98 World Cup, the '96 Euros, the 2002 World Cup. Like every garden on my street had people over, there was barbecues, we were all socialising, talking across the fence. Um, and as time has gone on, there seems to be less of that. There seems to be people, families, or households, because you might be renting a house for several friends, for example, become less. They become more insular. I think that's a noticeable trend. I could be wrong. I think the stats may or may not back that up. What I've noticed with major sporting events is back in the day, people go, "Oh, the boxing's on tonight. Let's all go out to the pub together. All come around a friend's house together and watch the game together." Like the Super Bowl this evening, for example. In America, I think it's a bit more of the social um, side of things. There'll be people having Super Bowl parties tonight. They're less popular than what they used to be 20 years ago. I won't watch the Super Bowl tonight because I've got to be up for work in the morning, but the trend applies. Um, Same with the Stanley Cup finals and the NBA championships. People would actually invite their friends over. Like the Thanksgiving Day, NFL matches, they would invite people over for Thanksgiving to watch the game. So they're becoming less noticeable. Um, so there's various things that we can look at. We can look at sporting events and viewership figures on TV and statistical trends. Including responses to street parties, barbecues, big sporting events bringing communities together. I think, although in more recent years it's been more go to public places to view the sporting events. No, I think I'm trying to get back onto the sporting event side of things. If we look at, let's say, the recent World Cups and Euros, a lot of people went to social gatherings, as in pubs, bars, and public places where the fan zones were set up to watch games, especially 2018 World Cup. I watched 2 games in the pub, and the rest of the games I watched at home by myself. But I spent the last 2 games England played, I went to the pub to watch them. The 2010 World Cup, I think most of the games I watched at the 2010 World Cup, I watched in the pub. The 2014 World Cup, I mixed it up a little bit. Some games in the pub, some games at home. The 2020 Euros, I watched a couple of games at my neighbour's house, but for the most part, watched them at home. Didn't go out at all. But so you could look at societal trends about fan zones being set up and watching in licensed premises because they obviously impact viewership figures. And then you can look at sales in pubs and restaurants and bars that would have a sports bar, for example, that has a big screen on or a couple of TVs on, and then you can look at viewership from people who are viewing at home on the internet or on TV. Um, but the viewership figures from the recent World Cup were mixed. I don't think they were as high as Euros, for example, or the previous World Cup in Russia. I think the viewership figures were down a bit, if I'm being honest. And there's various reasons for that. We know there was a lot of people who were deliberately boycotting viewing the tournament for a variety of reasons. Um, out in the rural area is better than living in the city because you probably know everyone. Well, I've lived in two big towns, and I'm living right now in a bit more of a smaller market town slash rural community because literally 5 miles down the road, I'm in the middle of the farmer's field in Hampshire. So, but I'm only 5 minutes away from being in a big urban area. So I'm right on the edge of suburbia, and living out in the middle of nowhere in the rural area. So I'm sort of in between. I understand what it's like with a close knit, small town, small village community, where everyone knows everyone. I don't think it's the case anymore. Yes, the population of where I live, I mean, technically, I'm the last building in the town, or I'm the first building in the village because of how the urban area is delineated when it comes to postcode. So in theory, I could be in the village or I could be in the town. Yes, that's weird how they work this out. Basically, the village is sort of being merged into the town. There's enough green space for it to be classed as two separate communities. Um, 30 years ago, yeah, I probably would know everyone on my road. Um, but now it's not the case. Yeah, I'm a 10-minute walk from the nearest train station. There's a bus stop literally behind my block of flats. Um, but yeah, I know what it's like when you've got a little bit of a walk, or um, if you do have a vehicle, motorcycle, or car. It's still a fair little journey to get to the nearest amenities. I'm not too bad, but that will also have an impact as well. Um, so this is where you have like a Forest Green Rovers, for example, and I use them as an example because obviously they're in Nailsworth in Gloucestershire, small community with a football league club. And have they reached their ceiling? And I believe that they have. I think I've been to Nailsworth as well. I've been past it on the motorway. I've also been to Nailsworth on a road trip and got lost. So I've actually been past Forest Green Rovers ground before they were a football league club. The irony. And I didn't know who it actually was until we. That's Forest Green Rovers, the pub team. Um, Jokes aside, because of their small catchment area in regards to the initial fan base, and the fact that they are a niche, technically football is a niche sport in Gloucestershire because it's rugby union and cricket, which are the major sports. Um, you could argue that a more rural location hampers the development of professional sport because you can't sustain yourself economically, um, because you haven't got enough people locally to buy into your sporting entity, buying tickets, buying merchandise, going to games, that kind of thing. And and that's why obviously economically they struggle because you haven't got the fan base locally, but also rural communities generally have lower average salaries and wages, so you have you know um, less disposable income. So there you go. Yeah, Nailsworth. I mean, look, there are parts of the country, even though obviously we are a small island nation with a very high population density, because of a few big towns and cities like London or Greater London, and towns and cities in the southeast, Birmingham and the rest of the West Midlands and Coventry, for example, um, southeast Wales, like Swansea and Cardiff, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Bradford. Take out some of these cities, Sheffield. In reality, there's some huge open spaces where you won't see, very very rural. Um, and there you go. In regards to rural locations, or those locations that have lower. But this is why there's no profession. There's high unemployment, less disposable income. So there you go. heavily reliant on agriculture and tourism, which are seasonal industries. So on the off season, or when you've got the downturn in agricultural production for uh, crops, for example, there's less work. There's a lot more seasonal work. So places like Cornwall and huge areas of Scotland are very regional in their employment. And then because you have that economic standpoint impacts professional sport because the locals have less disposable income to spend on tickets, merchandise, and then obviously you've got less of a fan base to build your club around. Yeah, Forest Green Rovers being the I think I'm not sure where Cheltenham Town are. I've got a video on Cheltenham Town, what league they're in, but Cheltenham Town is more stable as a football league club than Forest Green Rovers. Um, and Cheltenham, yes, home of British horse racing. Really, I think one of the hotbeds of British horse racing alongside Aintree and Newmarket and Royal Ascot and such. But horse racing is a major part of the sports scene in Cheltenham. But they have a football club, and Cheltenham Town is a more stable football league club than Forest Green Rovers. And could Cheltenham play at a high level? Possibly, but Gloucestershire is rugby union and cricket, and horse racing. They're your sports. So football doesn't really have a foothold in that part of the country. Um, a lot of people in the US think we're football mad across the country, and that isn't the case. It isn't the case. Rugby league is more popular in huge swathes of Yorkshire and Lancashire than football. Cricket is more popular in places like Kent and Somerset, and Gloucestershire than football. Um, you know, there are huge parts of the country that are rugby union hotbeds. Um, like Lincolnshire, you would think, like Lincoln and Boston, you would think, oh, yeah, no, rugby union is more popular in Lincolnshire than football. Um, do I think Japan one day will join the rugby championship? That's an interesting one. It's been discussed before with obviously the Sunwolves being part of the old Super Rugby setup. That is something that has been mentioned before. It's a possibility. They've definitely got the financial backing to do it. The money's there, the corporate money's there. Japan's got a massive population, which helps with a potential player base, potential fan base to grow the sport. And the sport's grown massively in Japan in the last 15, 20 years from where it was before. The national side's improved massively over the last bit. He's taken far more seriously now than what they were before. Um, so it's plausible. But at the same time, you look at the other nations that are involved in the rugby championship, they've got massive financial problems at main union level. And they've got issues with retaining playing talent. In Australia and New Zealand, the rugby league is a massive threat to them. And with their selection rules, a lot of players obviously want to get a decent salary because their careers are pretty short. And they're leaving to play in North America and Europe because they can get paid more. So, because of their national selection rules. So it's a possibility, whether it actually becomes an outcome. I mean, there was talk of Canada and the US at one point possibly expanding the Six Nations, or what was the Five Nations at one point. Look at the US and Canadians now, where their standing is, and well, they've gone backwards. So it's an interesting concept. Japan has definitely massively improved from where they were 2 decades ago. The last decade has seen rapid growth in the sport in Japan. They've hosted a World Cup very successfully, in my opinion. And they're now technically classed as a tier one nation, ironically, because of their world ranking. But again, does it make financial sense for the Japanese to do that for their union and the sport? Does it make financial sense? And there's a lot of other logistical issues to resolve because it'll be their summer and the Southern Hemisphere winter when they're playing. So when it comes to them playing at home, the temperatures, would that be conducive to playing high level test rugby in a Japanese summer, which in some parts of Japan can get bloody hot, really hot. It's subtropical in the southern islands of Japan, so that has to be bared in mind. So it's a possibility, but I don't think Um, it's high on the agenda right now. There'll be logistical issues, especially with Argentina, for example, which is really on the other side of the world, and South Africa. And there's also the financial aspect as well. Is it financially viable to do it? Um, Amongst a whole host of other issues. Um, and with the other four nations involved in the rugby championship, bearing in mind how long it took Argentina to get accepted uh, into the competition, and look at the struggles that Super Rugby has had and how it had to reformat itself completely, and how the South African clubs have left the Super Rugby format and gone into the European format. There's a lot of issues that the Southern Hemisphere nations have got to face head on. Money is a big issue, um, and would you get the same crowds as well? Because the rivalries that have deliberately been built in the Southern Hemisphere with the old Tri Nations and now the Rugby Championship, the rivalry, especially the Bledisloe Cup, for example, the real heated rivalry between South Africa and New Zealand, which is fantastic, by the way. Adding Argentina to the mix and what they bring and their style of rugby, which is fantastic, gnarly and nasty, but fantastic, um, has definitely it's taken a long time. It took a long time for Argentina to be taken seriously. I think Japan faced similar battles anyway, but then you've got to bring into the fact that when Japan would be playing those test matches, that would be in the height of the Japanese summer. And as I say, Japan is a very climatically diverse island chain, ironically. So Sapporo and Hokkaido, for example, is more alpine in their weather. They get some very cold winters up there. Whereas Kyushu, for example, like the southerly where Hiroshima is, for example, right at the bottom, is a subtropical climate at that time of year. And it can, and if you remember the Football World Cup of 2002, yeah, the games in Sapporo, they played in the dome because it's so bloody cold, and then the games in the Southern Islands, Japan, so bloody hot. Um, if I was a Celtic or Rangers fan, would you get bored of how uncompetitive the Scottish League is? I think Scottish fans in general are getting really frustrated with the state of the game north of the border. And I just not want Celtic or Rangers. Um, and that's something that the Scottish FA and the Scottish Professional Football League need to address drastically. Um, I don't know. As I say, football isn't my favourite sport. So even if I was north of the border, I would probably be more likely watching um, you know, ice hockey or rugby league anyway. Um, Look, as I say, there's a lot of fans who are of all clubs, Rangers and Celtic, who are very frustrated with the SFA and the SPFL. There's been a lot of allegations of corruption north of the border and nepotism north of the border, and really poor governance, uh, which added on top of Rangers and Celtic winning all the time, which is obviously deeply frustrating, and how the UEFA coefficient and legacy coefficient works, that hampers again um, direction and growth of the league. If Carlisle joined the Scottish League, how well? I think they would do pretty well. To be fair, I think they would do rather well. But it would also require Carlisle having some pretty decent financial backing to remain stable because they would lose a lot of income. I actually think, on a playing standpoint on paper, yes, they'll do well. On a financial standpoint, Carlisle would probably be bankrupt because they would lose so much income. So much income would be lost because you're playing the same 10, 11 teams regularly rather than 23 other teams. So, yeah, the income loss would be horrific. So, on a playing standpoint, yes, excellent. On a economic standpoint, they would be done. Because if, let's say, Carlisle were to say, look, can we apply to join the Scottish League system, they would have to start at the bottom, and that would kill them. It's like if Rangers and Celtic were to apply to join the English League system, for example, that would also not only kill them, but Scottish football. Because I honestly believe they wouldn't get past the Championship level. They might get to the Premier League and struggle, and then that leads. So, yeah, I don't think it would work. Queen of the South, really? Really? Really, really. Do I think Derry City? Politically, no. There's a reason why they've opted for the Island League rather than the League of Ireland, rather than the Irish Premiership, whatever it is. There's a reason why they play in the Irish League system rather than the Northern Irish League system. There's a lot of politics and social division behind it, and it would just be a political and social nightmare and a policing nightmare. There's a lot of community issues um, with Derry City. I think it's better if they stay in the Irish League system. If the Irish Leagues merge, would that be a better? Debatable. I think the Northern Ireland League's in a better position than the Southern Irish League, let's say that, or the League of Ireland. The FAI has got a lot of problems. I think the League of Northern Ireland is in a better financial state than the Southern Irish League, ironically. But again, there's a lot of political issues with that. I know rugby union and rugby league, you have a unified Irish team, and obviously also a part of the Pro League system or the United Rugby Championship system. But that is a historical agreement going back to before partition and before the Irish Civil War and the War of Independence, and when Ireland was a free state before it became a republic. And that is an agreement that's been in place with the Irish Union for donkeys. That's why they have two anthems. Um, Football is a lot more tribal, and then you suddenly get all the community rivalry because rugby union is very middle class in Ireland, very middle class sport. Rugby league is barely scratched the surface. Uh, so there is that. So yeah, I don't think they're leagues, mate. How does Ireland have its own national ice hockey team? Because the only ice rink is in Belfast, that I'm aware of. Um, unless it's to do with the university system, but that a national ice hockey team must be absolutely dreadful. And it's not really a sport that really appeals to the Irish consciousness, if I'm being honest, outside of Belfast. It really doesn't. Really doesn't. But I am surprised I've got an ice hockey team. But at the same time, I think it is the duty of a governing body to try and grow the sport globally. So in the IIHF's position, they're the governing body. They sanction all the World Championship events from the top tier all the way down to the development tiers and the lower levels of the game when it comes to international sport. It is their responsibility, I think, as a governing body, internationally at least, to try and grow the game internationally. Now, we all know that the NHL is the top league, professional league, and their affiliate league system with the AHL and ECHL. We all know that. There we go. You don't think you wait for like other nations in other leagues? Well, how do you mean? You mean UEFA liking other international governing bodies? Um, well, I mean, look, and other sports. Well, ice hockey is the second most popular sport in Europe for fan base and participation across the whole continent. And I think this is where professional football needs to learn to share. It's for its own benefit. Um, it really is. Uh, Football is the most dominant sport, um, globally, and um, it's ridiculous. The money side of things that the sport generates. It is not evenly distributed, and yeah, not every league is competitive. So there is that. The Cardiff Devils in ice hockey. My friend Sam has been to many, many games over the years. He's got several jerseys. I've seen the odd Cardiff Devils game when they've been U18. They're a very consistent side. Very consistent side. They're the only fully professional ice hockey team in Wales, although you've got the Dee Valley Dragons, I think their name is. D-side Dragons and the Cardiff Fire, who are an affiliate team of the Cardiff Devils. Um, I've seen the other team in Cardiff, the Cardiff Fire, play, and they really are dreadful. um, but joking aside, um, again, niche sport in a very niche market. Ice hockey is predominantly England and Scotland, um, and on that aspect, mostly central and northern England, where the majority of decent professional teams are based, and the border region and the lowland belt of Scotland. Um, and again, it's like traditional locations. So in this country, it's Yorkshire and the Midlands and parts of the southeast. Scotland are the traditional locations for ice hockey in this country. Um, Rugby league, again, the north of England, the M62 is the traditional locations like Lancashire, Yorkshire, and Cheshire. It's the traditional location. There are teams in other locations, but that's, you know, well, teams in London. You've got the Lee Valley Lions, the Raiders, who play on the edge of Essex, edge of London. You've got the um, Streatham Redhawks, Victor, who play on the outskirts of London, who are in Kent. You've got obviously the Guildford Flames, what was the Bracknell Bees, who are now sharing the Slough Jets on the outskirts of London. You've got Milton Keynes Lightning and Peterborough Phantoms, who are obviously in Buckinghamshire and Cambridgeshire, Basingstoke playing Hampshire. So there are teams in the southeast, but there isn't like a London team. There used to be, but there isn't anymore. Which is really surprising because you've got several big indoor arenas in London that could be used. And obviously, the NHL is continuing with its European series. It's very, very keen to take games across Europe in all the locations across Europe. It's very, very keen to do that. And there is obviously a fan base in the UK for ice hockey. I've seen every single NHL jersey you can think of. I've seen jerseys of various junior and minor leagues and other European leagues in and around games and around the UK. So there is clearly a fan base here in this country, much like the NBA and Major League Baseball and NFL. There's clearly fans here. How much to go? It's anywhere between 10 and 20 quid for a ticket. You can get group discounts. You can get really, really reasonably priced tickets. It's not overly expensive. It's not massively expensive to go see a game. Really. Average I've spent on a ticket is I've never spent more than £15 on a ticket ever. Yes, we do have a national side, and some of my friends have been part of that national side. I know people who've actually played for the national side, both men's and women's. So there's that. We do have a national side. We're in the second tier of international ice hockey. We were at the top level of World Championships. We're now in Group A1, and we're hosting our level of international ice hockey in Nottingham this year. So yes, we do have a national. Oh no, it's not bad. It's not bad. It's cheaper than a football league ticket, I think now. I would say in Anglesey, your closest team would be D-side Dragons. They're not very good. Or Manchester. Manchester Storm in the Elite League. That would be costing a little bit more. And I think that's part of the problem is certain areas of the country don't have an ice rink. Cardiff Devils, yeah, they've got a decent team, and it's a decent arena. It's a very modern arena as well, which is helpful. But that's a fair journey from Anglesey to go down to Cardiff. So that'll be an all weekend kind of event. But they've got some very, very good players. If you want to go to a game nearer to Anglesey or similar distance, Manchester or Sheffield, or Hull or someone like that would be a better experience. And it's all about how you get there and then logistics behind it. But I would say Sheffield's probably the best experience. Um, on Olympic qualification, um, ooh, that's an interesting one. It all depends on how we do in our World Championship group to get back to the top level. We are hosting in Nottingham. We have a very good chance of actually winning our group and getting back to the top flight. Um, and again, player development. I think we're very likely to get more players drafted by NHL teams, whether they actually play in the NHL or not is another thing. I think we are going to have more players drafted by the NHL, um, which will be interesting. I think that there are players in the pipeline that may get drafted, which I think will definitely help. Um, whether we qualify for the Olympics, honestly, I think ice hockey at the Olympics, because there's been the issues over will the NHL players be allowed to go, and they didn't go to the Beijing Games, and there's the situation of play. It's possible. It is possible. Whether it actually happens or not is another debate to have. Um, but it is what it is. Funding is a big issue for it as well, massive issue. But again, we'll have to see how things play out, and if the continued growth of the sport can be sustained long term, and more kids and more fans want to play and watch, and more investment in the sport. Without investment, you don't go anywhere. Um, there's only so much you can do on limited budgets and with limited media exposure. Um, and I think that the mainstream media in this country really is missing a trick with what is a very marketable product. Very marketable product. Um, and it's those in charge of the broadcasters who are really missing a trick, and I think failing a very popular sport. Um, I think the issue which ice hockey faces over other sports is the expense of equipment, training, and getting kids to play. It's not a cheap sport, and that's where things like the WIHF and the NHL, for example, who raid Europe for their best players in the draft, could do more rather than just taking games on the road. Actually, help invest in the sport here, so it actually they could do invest in grassroots to make it, give grants and things, and scholarships to actually benefit the sport more. They have the money to do it. They're making record profits. I think that's definitely something that can be done. Is bigger leagues like the NHL could do a lot more in supporting the sport at grassroots level, because it is an exceptionally expensive sport to participate in. It's the Canadians, by the way, Canadians, Canada. Canada is like the Brazil of ice hockey. Canada is the All Blacks of ice hockey. The Canadians, you know, are the best team historically. The Soviet Union no longer exists, so they're less potent. The Russians, the former Soviet republics, don't have the same impact. It's Canada. The US is, I think, a closing second, and then you've got like the Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Finland. I'm not far behind either. But Canada, historically, if you take the Soviet Union out of it, it has been the best side for a very long time. And some of those Canadian teams over the years have been stacked, like ridiculously stacked. But then you look at some of the Soviet teams of the 70s and 80s, they were pretty stacked as well. Um, and some of those Russian teams from the early 90s were just ridiculously talented. And some of the Czech and Slovak teams as well, or the Czechoslovak teams of the past, were stacked. The Swedes and the Finns have had some pretty stacked sides as well, but no, Canada is like the Brazil of ice hockey when it comes to Brazilian football. Um, and yeah, there's some pretty. I mean, let's say the Oilers, for example, don't do well in the Stanley Cup playoffs throughout the first round. They fail to qualify, which is a possibility, even though they're battling for the Pacific Division title. Connor McDavid. Oh, field hockey we talk about now. India's pretty good. We're pretty good. Australia's pretty good. Canada's pretty good. A lot of the Commonwealth nations are pretty good at field hockey, but and also a lot of European nations as well. Yeah, we won an Olympic gold in the 30s. We won a few Olympic silvers in the 20s and 30s. We were pretty good back in the day. We're not so good now. But no, the Canadians really have made it their sport. Um, they do underachieve at times. They have underachieved at times. But I think it's something like 70% of all Canadians at some point played hockey growing up as a kid. Um, so it's ridiculous the percentage of participation at some point with ice hockey. It's ridiculous. Are we as patriotic if it's the UK or England or Great Britain? Whenever I see the national side play, be it the Olympics or things like ice hockey, for example, I see a fair bit of patriotism there, the support's definitely there. I can't argue against that. But for example, obviously when it comes to sports like rugby union outside of the lines, for example, rugby union and football, more tribal. Rugby league outside of the club game, I think that the Lions is better supported in league than the national sides. The GB Lions seem to be much better supported in regards to how fans interact with the Lions in when it comes to rugby league. But it does depend on the sport. It does depend on the sport, absolutely. It's how things have gone. Yeah, if you take out like rugby union, rugby league, and football and cricket, it is mostly the national side. Is all of the British Isles, all of the UK, or GB, which is UK and Northern Ireland, for example. Um, and that also includes like things like Channel Islands and the Isle of Man as well. It's GB. When it's the UK, does not include the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man. When it's the GB and Northern Ireland, there you go. I mean, I think certain sports are far more tribal and more political than others, um, which then leads to a certain aspect of nastiness. Which there's rivalry and then there's deliberate nastiness. Well, it's because we have the different league structures and we have the different football associations, and there does seem to be that deliberate. How do I put this? I know England isn't the most population, but a deliberate sort of xenophobia. Maybe it's a word, maybe it's a strong word, but a deliberate ploy by various sections of the media to rile up the really idiotic members of the working class. Um, look, again, obviously there are continual plans to keep trying to qualify a GB side for the Olympics in football, and I think the women's game has got more chance of that becoming a reality on a more consistent basis over the men's game. There's clearly that intent there, but it also comes down to the cooperation between the various football associations, and the SFA seems to have this perverse resistance to cooperating with the other home nation football associations on a variety of matters. The Scottish FA really do have a real perverse notion of cooperation with the other home nations in regards to youth and a whole range of issues. They're not going to lose their football associations. It's just called cooperation. It's generally a thing that reasonable people do and organisations do is they cooperate to achieve a common goal. And the SFA is just bordering on ridiculous with its refusal on so many issues to cooperate with other sporting governing bodies to get solutions. Not even just football, it's just cooperating in regards to implementing communal sports really should work together. They just have a real perverse pleasure of just self harm. And then Scottish fans wonder why the sport's in such a shambles north of the border. That includes youth development, scouting, quality of quality of products, the fact that the league is becoming more uncompetitive by each sip of Fanta Orange Zero Sugar that I take. Not that I'm sponsored by the Coca-Cola company, but the facts are there. Do I like the Davis Cup? Like I said, I'm really not following tennis as much as um, never really got into the Davis Cup. Um, it's one of those kind of less less important international tournaments. Yeah, 2012, the English FA Block League players who played in the Euro. Well, with the Olympics as well, you've got I think there's X amount of overage players or senior players who are allowed in the squad. The rest have to be under 23 or younger or something. Um, because the IOC and FIFA obviously came to an agreement. Because obviously the Olympics originally was you had to be all amateurs, you couldn't be all professional, and in order to sort of maintain that, development players, so your youth players and your squad players who aren't always playing all the time, so they had to be of a younger age with only a few senior players allowed. Um, I believe they did. Yes, they did. I think they used 4 stadiums for the tournament, the Olympic tournament. I remember correctly. They used Old Trafford, Cardiff, Wembley, and the Olympic Stadium 4 matches. I believe I could be wrong, but that was 11 years ago. I mean, the one thing I took out of the Olympics that I really, when it comes to sports kits, was the Great Britain kit was fantastic. Of course, the atmosphere would be weird because of the tribalism that obviously we were brought up with in regards to international football and club football. Of course, it would be really odd putting on a Union Jack rather than an England flag or a Welsh flag, Scottish or Northern Irish, St George Cross with the red hand or the harp, depending on your background in Northern Ireland and what flag you see as the appropriate flag for Northern Ireland. It was um, a bit odd. And I do want to get my hands on a London 2012 GB Olympic football kit. They are quite nice. Not going to lie, they are actually one of the more pleasant kits when it comes to international sport that I want to get my hands on, and they go for a lot of money. Um, a lot of money. Yeah, Mika Richards. I mean, certain players did have to make the choice whether they went to the Olympics, went to the Euros, because basically at the same time they were happening at roughly the same time. And of course, load management is a term that we use a lot now when it comes to professional sports. Managing the amount of game time players play, and high profile players in a lot of sports have said, a lot of teams have said, load management. We're men here, we're not boys. So the NHL is discussing it right now. Brad Marchand, who has been very outspoken on a lot of things in recent weeks, goes load management. What's a load of BS? We're hockey players, not kids. That was his view on it. And load management and player um, and yeah, I think no. Stuart Pearce was the coach. Giggs played, yes. Craig Bellamy, a player I dislike intensely, played. And was it Taylor or was it Joe Allen? It was one or the other. Ended up being part of the squad. Either Joe Allen or Taylor, Swansea player, if I remember correctly. Um, but yeah, because of squad selection rules, I think they were the 3 senior players that were allowed to be part of the setup. I think David Beckham was involved with the coaching setup or the off-field setup in regards to communications or media or PR or something. David Beckham was involved in the Olympic setup. Um, but yeah, the that Olympic jersey is quite a collector's item. They're not cheap. I think Pearce obviously wanted to be the England manager, and I think a way to do that was to manage an international, at a high level with what we classed as full international caps and such. And he'd been a club manager with Man City, and he wanted to be the full-time England manager. and he had his one game, I believe, not long after that Olympics. There was a big talk about Roy Hodgson. Obviously, he was installed as the interim manager, and Stuart Pearce had managed that one game, England versus Holland, I think, just not long before the 2012 Euros in Ukraine and Poland. Of course, Roy Hodgson was put in because Capello had obviously been given the boot, and I can't remember if Stuart Pearce managed a game before or after Roy Hodgson, but I know Stuart Pearce wanted to get the England job at the time. And we can all debate pros and cons of not having Stuart Pearce in that management capacity for England on a full-time basis. We can all debate that. I think his window long since passed. But Stuart Pearce is a very interesting character in the world of football. I think he's very underrated in his knowledge of the game and various aspects. But I think Allen and Ramsey then would have been under the age of 23 there, because you had to be under the age of 23 to be part of the squad, unless you were one of the three overage players. So I think it was Giggs, Bellamy, and Taylor were the three overage players, and the rest of the squad basically England. No, I don't think Stuart Pearce wasn't really caring. I think he obviously wanted to get into full-time international management at the senior level, and I think he felt the Olympics was. I think he took on the job with a great sense of responsibility and dignity. But obviously, it's a one-off position that doesn't have a long-term outcome. And obviously, his managerial career has sort of petered out. But Stuart Pearce strikes me as one of those individuals who is brutally honest and is a down-to-earth human being who's actually lived in the real world. Because people tend to forget that Stuart Pearce, before he was a professional football player, is a fully qualified electrician, and he continues to update his electrician city and guilds qualifications and MBQs in his spare time. So if he never go back to football coaching and football management, he's a fully qualified electrician. He learned a trade to be a backup. And then ultimately Nottingham Forest come along, and obviously he becomes the professional player that we love and remember from the 80s and 90s. But Stuart Pearce was late to the game, so was Ian Wright. And yeah, we can argue the pros and cons of his coaching ability with Man City and the under 21s of England, and his brief interim stint as England head coach. But I think he should have been given the reins over Roy Hodgson personally. I think England would have done possibly better than what they did under Hodgson, and maybe we wouldn't have had Southgate. And then the story's different, ultimately. We can debate that. That's with hindsight and with that kind of ability, maybe he should have been given a further chance in club management outside of Nottingham Forest. It didn't go well at Nottingham Forest. And I don't think his managerial career is completely dead. But he hasn't had as many managerial opportunities as I think he should have. And for whatever reason, whether that's good or bad for the English game, that's up for debate. In regards, it would be interesting if we did have a national side of all four home nations for football, but that would then require combining all the domestic leagues together and all the FAs together into a UK FA, and that's never going to happen. There's too much resistance from a large portion of Scottish football, and to a certain extent, obviously Northern Ireland, there's a lot of politics there, and Wales, I think there's a certain resistance from some in the Welsh game. I don't particularly like Ryan Giggs as a person either. He was one of my favourite players growing up. Even though he played for a team I didn't particularly like very much, Man United, Ryan Giggs is one of those players that I did enjoy watching as a kid and as a young adult. I mean, look at his career, how long his career lasted. There is no doubt, as a player, he was a machine, and kept himself in the best shape. I mean, his fitness is ridiculous. played. I think he played 4 decades technically. If you want to get really technical, 3 decades or something. So Ryan Giggs, yeah, ridiculous. Played the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, and went on to coach into the 2020s. So his footballing career was ridiculous. I thought, although yeah, it was part of the class of '92, a 3 decade career. Um, so as a player on the field, fantastic player. It's the off the field issues that obviously bring up the idea of him as a person not being particularly a pleasant individual. And that kind of Ryan Giggs is not a particularly nice individual comes in around 2010 with the super injunction that obviously we know it's Imogen Thomas and we know what he did with his brother's wife, Rodri's wife. And then we find out about his father as a person and the relationship between Giggs and his dad and how he took his mother's name, which was Giggs. His dad had a different surname, how he gave up a career in rugby league um, to take up football. He was actually rugby league by birth, was really his sport that he chose to do. And he had a trial. Oh, was it Australian schoolboys versus England schoolboys, or GB schoolboys or England schoolboys? He was playing in one of those tour matches, and some Australian scouts looked at this Ryan. I forget what his dad's surname is, and he also had a trial at Man United at the time, and he was turned down. And then Ferguson was like, "This is Giggs kid." Oh, you met him before? He's oh yeah. So he could have played rugby league for Wales and GB. Ryan Wilson, that's it. And he was impressing rugby league scouts as a teenager, and then he ultimately ended up being part of the class in '92, and the rest is obviously history on a playing standpoint, success he had as a player. Um, but as a human being, he's not a particularly nice person, no. And the warning signs were there towards the end of his playing career that there were some real severe issues off the field um, that were clearly very negative. Um, and obviously, it's impacted the direction. He's lost his job as the Welsh national coach. And then his personal life has obviously been much media speculation. The criminal charges he faces, and the allegations of domestic violence and other issues off the field, potential drug use, and yeah, the fall from grace, I think, is something. And this comes at a time when Mason Greenwood's situation and the culture within Man United has been questioned with what's happened with Mason Greenwood and whether he should have had the charges, the CPS dropping charges, or whether he should have faced trial and can he be reintegrated back in the Man United setup, how that's going to pan out. Um, the culture within football is as a general rule. Um, and how much of this was Alex Ferguson aware of some of the issues off the field, because Ferguson had basically a no dickhead policy. That was a Ferguson thing. There was a no dickhead policy, and obviously with Giggs, some of the allegations against him date back to Fergie era. And then he was obviously involved with David Moyes, and he was interim coach. Um, so there you go. You need to sum it up. Have my views on the sport. I love the rivalries that sport gives us, but there are certain aspects where there's rivalry, and then there's the ridiculous nature. When I say ridiculous, the negative side of it, with the hooligan nature and tribalism to a certain extent, but then you've got the nasty aspects of xenophobia and the nasty aspects that I think bring the sport down. Um, don't get me wrong, I love the rivalries in rugby league and ice hockey as well, and they're equally as brutal. But the fans, although there's a very small minority in those sports that again bring the sports down, the players take it out on each other. Fans, there's more good-natured banter, especially when it comes to things like Magic Weekend in the NRL. There was a few ugly incidents last year, which were, in my opinion, shameful. Not on the level of the disorder we saw at the Euros, for example. So, and when I used to do the London doubleheader weekend at Twickenham and Rugby Union, the fans, the good-natured banter, and then in 2011, just before the 2011 Rugby Union World Cup. My ex-partner at the time lived in southwest London, well, not too far from Twickenham, really, just on the edge of Surrey, edge of southwest London, near Kingston upon Thames. And I changed trains to Twickenham, and I was just told by the staff there, by the way, you've got 80,000 drunk rugby fans. Oh, God, I didn't realise there was a, this is well before I had a channel, didn't realise there was a test match. And then as soon as she said that, the first drunk fans were pouring onto the station. God, I better go on this train. This train better turn up quick. But every time there was a double header weekend, normally in August at Twickenham, I would bump into London Irish fans on the train, Saracens, Wasps, Harlequins. The teams from outside London would be coming down to games. The days Northampton fans or Leicester or Exeter. I've never had an issue with rugby union fans at all. A couple of years ago, I went to London to watch an ice hockey match with my friend Sam at Streatham. To the game, fine. He went in our hockey jerseys. We were having a laugh. Um, Coming back from the game, we got to Paddington, and that's where things got interesting between Chelsea, Arsenal. Oh God, Chelsea, Arsenal, Brentford, QPR, Fulham. I think all the teams of North and West London were at Paddington at the same time because I think all of them were away fans back then. They'd all somehow got to Paddington. It became a bit tasty in the evening. I was like, this could be a nasty state of affairs if it's the wrong setup. Turns out they're all a bunch of mates watching, decided to go out together, but you could tell that Arsenal's got, and I thought this could be a flashpoint. And it was a bit less, a lot of people were suddenly very, very nervous who were non-football fans that day, very, very nervous about the potential outcomes of football fans. That's rugby fans. There's less tension in the air. So I think the media has definitely hyped up the fact that football fans are a nightmare. But I have seen instances at rugby where people have been clearly too much to drink. Um, you know, not, but there's less incidents, there's less trouble. I think it's how the fan base has been, told, brought up, the culture and values of the sport, um, and the fans seem to be more respectful. Although I've noticed as time has gone on, the fans are becoming less and less respectful and more toxic with rugby union over football. I'm actually finding football fans, for a general rule, when I look at the comments section, when I look at responses to videos and my responses to reviews, um, and the club histories, tend to be better behaved now on social media than they were, at least on my channel. Rugby union fans definitely becoming more and more toxic over the last 4 or 5 years. But that's just a personal observation. Whether that's the truth globally or nationally is a different thing. Oh, okay. How did the tournament go at the Watford training ground? I hope it obviously went well, and you had a good time, and everyone had a good time, and obviously everyone enjoyed the tournament and each other's company. Obviously, something that it needs to be publicised more. These community-based incentives from clubs hosting tournaments for disadvantaged people, disability, or amateurs. I don't think enough exposure's done for these or community tournaments like five-a-side, things like that. I think. Do I have a favourite sport? I'm always a massive fan of motorsport, be it rallying or sports car racing or touring cars. Motorsport, my, anything to do with two or four wheels, I salivate over. Apart from F1, I've gone off F1 completely, and MotoGP, I'm less interested in now than what I was a decade ago. So anything motorsport related that's fast, dangerous, and has two or four wheels, I will watch. Apart from F1 and MotoGP, so motocross, rallying, endurance racing, anything to do with IMSA or the Le Mans series, so prototype hypercars, for example. You give me a 24-hour, 12-hour endurance race, I will sit and watch the old bloody thing. I've nearly finished the 24 Hours of Daytona, which is on 4 parts on the IMSA YouTube channel. I've got part 4 to watch. Nearly watched the whole of that. That the last 2 weeks. That is exhausting. The 12 Hours of Sebring, I love that race because both races are in Florida, The ironic thing is they're on either side of Florida. One's on the east coast, one's on the west coast. So the weather conditions really have an impact on Daytona and Sebring because they're on either side of Florida. One's on the east coast, one's on the west coast. So the weather conditions really have an impact on Daytona and Sebring. They can really have an impact on the conditions, um, which is something. Um, but no, I like my rugby league and I like my ice hockey, and I really have to do an updated my favourite sports updated video for 2023 and list them. Um, and you're going to be surprised. Do I have an overall favourite sport? I would say my favourite sports leagues are the NRL and NHL in equal measure. I watch more rugby league than ice hockey at the moment. It's just easier with the TV rights or streaming rights. So I have the NRL website, which is really good for league. And of course, moving away from my local ice rink and therefore being further away from my I'm in between where the Bees play and the Guildford Flames play, so I have a choice, and it's a pain in the arse to get both by train. So there's that to bear in mind. But no, rugby league and ice hockey are my two favourite sports. They're the two most brutal sports, but they're motorsport, just motorsport, and I will exclude F1 and MotoGP, but that's pretty much Formula E. I've dabbled in, I've given it a go. Um, Formula E doesn't do it for me. It's not because the cars don't have that sound; it's some of the gimmicks like the boost button, this and that. No, just have them, just allow them to go flat out for the entire race without having like a boost button, please. But no, I'll have to do an updated favourite sports again. You had a good time. We won two of one of the teams didn't turn up. The other one left. See their teammate in hospital, so I respect that. We lost one and drew three, so 2, 1, and 3. I mean, look, you've won, you've lost, you've drawn, you had fun. That's the important thing. And it's a community-based tournament, so it's fantastic um, that you're part of a community-based incentive for disabled fans and disabled teams. It's great. I like that. I think that needs to get more advertising and more promotion. So like this is what high-profile professional teams in, let's say, football or rugby league or rugby union or ice hockey, whatever the sport may be, they need to promote it more so that we're more inclusive. Um, and then you get those fans go, what? Oh, this is a forced diversity crap. I hate. We did a disability football tournament years ago at Northampton Sixfield. Again, I think this is what gets talked about the mainstream media and stuff. They don't pay attention to the community aspect of sport, especially football. The history of the clubs within the towns they play in, that kind of thing. Um, the community aspect gets forgotten. And especially, and this is where I think Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney with Wrexham really have understood the importance of community with Wrexham. And it could have been any football club they bought. They could have bought Yeovil, they could have bought Macclesfield, Chesterfield, or any club in the lower football league or non-league. They could have bought. They could have bought a Premier League club. The aspect on community is a key component of their ownership, which I think a lot of owners don't realise. I think this is where Leicester, for example, have a good relationship with the city of Leicester. Leicester City, a big relationship there with being, the city's club. This is our team. Sunderland, I think, the Sunderland till I died just showed how important the community aspect is. Um, so a lot of owners do forget that. A lot of the US side of fans who just watch the Premier League on NBC, SN, for example, or CBC. I can't remember who has the better. I think it's NBC, SM. Excuse me. Don't really understand and appreciate the community aspects of football clubs and or any sports team and the communities they're based in. They really underestimate that impact because of the franchise model they have in North America. They really underestimate the community impact these clubs have, and really it shocks them quite a bit. And this is how the European club system and league system is completely different to the North American system. It's a community aspect that I wouldn't say the American fans don't understand, but I don't think they really truly appreciate how ingrained it is in our sporting culture. Massive impact, massive how impacted it is on our sporting culture. Yeah, Wrexham is the only club in that part of Wales of any size with a bit of catchment area. It's not just Wrexham; it's the wider. There are fans in England who are Wrexham fans. So anyway, it's the catchment area across the border um, as well. It's not just a Welsh club; it's a club in an area of the UK which has a very wide catchment area for a small population size. There you go. Right, I'm going to call that a day. Thank you very much for all your questions. Some really interesting stuff we discussed towards the end there. And I will do an updated list of my favourite sports. I'll do my 5 favourite sports I think this time. An updated list for 2023. But anyway, thank you very much for all your questions. Really appreciate it. And I'll have some more content for you very, very soon. Come on.